Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see the screen? Excellent. As a way of living into so many of the words, the beautiful words that have been spoken thus far today, I'm going to invite you either to observe or participate in a very short practice of grounding, of reorientation, of presence. In Hebrew, it's called singing a nigun. A nigun is a practice of allowing melody to move through you without words. And I find that it's particularly helpful in interreligious contexts because it requires no particular theological commitment other than to be present to the sound and to be present to the moment. So even if you only sing in the shower, you're welcome to join me. Or you can just sit and observe and enjoy the quiet and the musical notes. Thank you. What I'd like to share with you this afternoon is a portion of a study that I'm doing on two great American interreligious pioneers. I do so because I feel like as this field continues to grow, it's important to understand its history, or to use a term that was used earlier in the day but differently in this context, our genealogy, which is to say, as the rabbis do in the ancient works of the Talmud, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. And as we're exploring these particular individuals in relationship to each other, I want you to think about several of the ideas, of the practices, of the modalities that have been discussed over the course of the day, because these are two embodiments of much of what we've been discussing, and two embodiments, I think, still of much of what we need to continue to learn as we continue to craft, to shape, to mold the field of interreligious engagement. I entitled this version of this presentation, My Black Rebbe. And I did so because in 1955, a young Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, then still actually only known as Schachter, having not yet extended his name, was a student at Boston University's School of Theology. And the person that inspired, impressed, reoriented him most significantly was a man by the name of the Reverend Howard Thurman. And I'll say more about each in a moment, but the title represents this young transplant from Eastern and Central Europe, his mindset after spending a year with a very unlikely master. Because the word Rebbe in Hebrew, or in Yiddish, in Hasidic context, that is, in the milieu of Eastern European mystics, is applied only to a person that is a true master. And as you can imagine, in 1955, or in the year 2025, there are very few people that emerged out of one or the other Hasidic dynasties and would spend a year in a Methodist university at a theological school and pronounce that an African American, Southern American Christian teacher was their Rebbe. And so that says a lot about the relationship and about these two individuals. I want you to look at the painting before you on the left before looking to the right. The main painting is of the sixth Rebbe, the master of Chabad Lubavitch, one of the largest dynasties within this Eastern European mystical movement. It's a painting that Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who died in 2014, took with him from one city to the next, from 1950 to 2014. This, in fact, is a photograph of the painting in his last home office, which I sometimes describe as his holy man cave, in the basement of his Boulder, Colorado home. And you'll see that it is not only a painting of this master, the sixth Rebbe of Chabad, but typical of Reb Zalman in his idiosyncratic way, along the bottom of the painting, he placed photographs of several other people that he considered to be his masters, the people with whom he wanted to commune when he was at prayer or studying in his home office. And among them now, you'll see two Christian figures, one, the aforementioned Howard Thurman, and the other, of course, being the great Trappist monk, Father Thomas Merton. Thurman and Merton, along with several other Hasidic masters. Again, just so you begin to understand who these figures were and what we might have to learn from them aesthetically, ethically, and ideologically. I want to begin with Howard Thurman because, as I said to someone at lunch today, I still think that so many years after his death, he is one of the least well-known and the perhaps least well-known, most significant religious leader of the last 100 years. And thankfully, there is the burgeoning of a field of Thurman studies that's taken place at BU, at Emory, at a few other centers. But I just want to recall this phrasing from Dr. Hessler's former boss at Marsh Chapel, that is Dean Robert Hill. He, that is Howard Thurman, was 100 years ahead of his time 50 years ago. So he's still 50 years ahead of you and me. I commend to you this documentary by Martin Doblmeier that was made just a few years ago called Backs Against the Wall, and it is a biography of Thurman. A few biographical notes just to contextualize this exploration. Howard Thurman was born in 1899. He was born the grandchild of a freed slave, and he lived in West Palm Beach, Florida. He experienced the brutality of white Christian oppression daily in his life. He was an unusually bright and intrepid student. He goes on to achieve great academic success. He was also a person, I used the word idiosyncratic before, I want to use it again, because he followed his own inclinations. And among his informal educational experiences that was change-making for him was studying informally with the Quaker mystic Rufus Jones in 1929. Among the other things that I want to make mention of, including his various posts, both as a scholarly presence but also as a pastoral presence, is that Thurman was among the first people to meet with Mahatma Gandhi and one of the most important people to translate that theory of nonviolent resistance in the United States. Among the pieces of work that we have of his great reservoir of creativity is a book called Deep River, an interpretation of Negro spirituals. That was both, of course, a political and a theological exercise. He's most well known for, and this book should also be required reading, Jesus and the Disinherited, which became the theological treatise for Dr. King and other members of the civil rights movement. He served as dean of Marsh Chapel, importantly, from 1953 to 1965. And the last thing that I'll mention here, without going into the episode of the Good Friday experiment, which is fascinating in of itself, is that he visited his graduate, that is Rabbi Schachter, in 1963. And Thurman, who did not like air travel, spent weeks traveling by train from the United States to Canada, and each of those stops he wrote about as a kind of spiritual travelogue, and we'll dip into that as we go. Zalman Schachter Shalomi, as I said, was a transplant from Poland and then Austria. He and his family escaped the Nazis. He came to the United States in 1940. He was ordained in 1947. He became a Chabad Lubavitch Chassid. And then in 1955, through his travels to colleges and universities, decided that he wanted to study psychology and was particularly interested in the psychology of religion. BU was one of the premier centers. And so with the permission of his Rebbe, his Chabad Rebbe, he went and studied with Thurman. He then went on to become a kind of trailblazing spiritual teacher, a countercultural figure in American Jewish life, and by the time that he died in 2014 was seen as a kind of globe-trotting international man of wisdom, meeting with the Dalai Lama and other such figures. But his training, as it were, in interreligious engagement started much more humbly and modestly, and Thurman was, in that sense, his Rebbe. Part of what I want to try and sketch here briefly are the lessons in affinities. Because again, I think it's important to understand some of the hallmarks of these pioneering figures and the things that we might learn from them across space and time. Interreligious hospitality, mystical pluralism, experiential education, pastoral care, and what I'm calling postmodern shamanism. I'm going to start with mystical pluralism, and I'm going to just read briefly rather than read the paper that I prepared. Here is Thurman famously about his primary experience of God as a child that he returned to and retold over and over again. As a boy, I walked along the beach of the Atlantic in the quiet stillness that can only be completely felt when the murmur of the ocean is stilled and the tides move stealthily along the shore. I held my breath against the night and watched the stars etch their brightness on the face of the darkened canopy of the heavens. I had the sense that all things, the sand, the sea, the stars, the night, and I were one lung through which all of life breathed. Not only was I aware of the vast rhythm enveloping all, but I was a part of it, and it part of me. Here you see the mystic and the poet. Here you could describe, using scholarly terms, a vision of panentheism. I was a part of it, and it a part of me. Reb Zalman, from a very different set of life experiences, came to a similar kind of theological worldview. The little booklet on the far side, called The First Step, was his attempt, actually, to create a Thurman-like manual for young Jewish students, modeled on Thurman's book on spiritual practices and disciplines. All is filled with life. Wherever we turn, life abounds. All of life proceeds from a source. For with thee is the source of life. In thy light do we see light. Quoting from the book of Psalms. Life is the effulgence of the infinite. Like sunlight proceeding from the sun, so does the light of the infinite proceed to reflect him. Everything alive thus basks in his radiance. This was, as Thurman would describe it, the ground of his theological worldview and that of Zalman Schachter, later Schachter Shalomi. But what was more important than systematic theology to either of these men, I think we could describe them aptly, beautifully, as applied theologians, was the ways in which they worked with theological belief and experience in the educational setting. Remember, this is circa 1955, required both to attend the lecture and the lab. Here is what Rabbi Zalman reflected on decades later. And it came directly from that 6:30 a.m. experience at BU. People seldom have those primary experiences in religion referred to by William James, Aldous Huxley, and others. But without first-hand knowledge, the study of religion is impoverished. Does this sound familiar from other speakers? Such primary experiences allow the student to understand what is being taught, and the use of experiential labs, that Thurman term, is now a part of my method. In fact, I've often found that they turn out to be extremely important in the spiritual growth of many individuals. In the exchanges with Dean Thurman and the other members of the class, I learned an important lesson that is still at the center of my thinking. Hold your hats or yarmulkes. Judaism and all other Western religions are suffering from having become over-verbalized and under-experienced. Someone else's description of ecstasy or spiritual at-oneness, given second or third hand, is simply not enough for us. We want to have these experiences for ourselves, and I wanted to make it possible for other people to have them too. This is what a part of a living, breathing religion is about, and I learned this from Dean Thurman. Look at the talit, the prayer shawl on the left side of the page. This may be confounding to you, but before Reb Zalman designed the first multicolored prayer shawl inspired by the kind of experiential and experimental educational offerings at BU, Jewish prayer shawls were either black and white or occasionally blue and white after the establishment of the State of Israel and the adoption of the blue and white flag. It's such a concrete example of what it is to live Judaism in a multicolored reality. But it requires pioneers to actually create such innovations. Mystical pluralism, experiential education. The third component is pastoral care. BU was, as I said, a center, perhaps the leading center for the study of the psychology of religion at the time, and pastoral care was a burgeoning field. Here is what Howard Thurman said about his own career. It was my discovery that more than campaigns or propaganda, however efficacious in creating the climate for social change, my gifts moved in the direction of the motivation of the individual and what could be done by the individual in his world, in his home, in his life, on his street. Which is to say, when Thurman emerged out of seminary and was recognized very quickly as a gifted teacher, preacher, and writer, there was an expectation that he would in fact be who Martin Luther King Jr. became. Except that Thurman was not a frontline activist. He wasn't particularly interested or skilled at organizing large groups for protest and the like. In fact, one of his detractors said, "We thought we had discovered Moses. It turns out that he is a mystic." Of course, I take exception to that kind of bifurcation, but the point is that pastoral care for Thurman was his social calling. And I want to say to each and every one of you, particularly the younger people in the room, we need all hands on deck, which is why Thurman repeatedly said, listen for the sound of the genuine within you and within others. What are your skills, talents, and passions? Pursue those. Here's Walter Flucker, who's taught many of us in this room. Thurman's pastoral ministry extended beyond the public sphere to personal encounters with individuals who found in his presence a cove to experience the literal truth of God. This was part of his ministry, performed for so many who had to deal with the harsh and often brutal realities of living in a society that rendered them either invisible or the objects of scorn. Somehow he was able to dig deep into the inner recesses of one's being, in the places which for others seemed unreachable, and to find the hidden treasures of the soul. Thurman was therefore widely recognized as the pastoral leader of the civil rights movement. And you see Polly Murray and MLK on the left-hand side of the page. I also want to point out that Thurman didn't do this pastoral work alone. His wife was very much a part of a kind of dynamic duo at BU and at other stops along the way, Sue Bailey Thurman. Reb Zalman learned from Thurman what his avoda, which is what we would call it in Hebrew, what his devotional service should be. And of course it was iterative and experimental. Two of his foremost students were Arthur Waskow and Michael Lerner, who are probably the most well-known progressive Jewish activists in the last 50 years. But that was not Reb Zalman. Reb Zalman left studying with Thurman and dedicated much of his life to pastoral and spiritual care of different kinds, which is why his major study of Jewish pastoral care was a comparison between Hasidic models of counseling and those of the Western world. Here's a description of one of his students. Not only was Hillel House always open to us, so too was Zalman's home on Inkster Boulevard in the north end of the city. His basement was a scene from another world, with mechanical and electronic devices of various kinds, some his own invention. In his basement, one could experience a light show, a sound show, or an art show. Of course, Zalman came of age as a beatnik, as a hippie, and so that was the aesthetic. Here's how Arthur Green described Reb Zalman. Zalman wanted to be sure he was right there at your gate, the unique way that would work only for your shoresh haneshama, your soul root. Welcome to being, speaking, feeling like an insider to our tradition. He made us understand that the tradition was ours to inherit, to love, and to make better, especially more inclusive as we pass it on. And it's important to say in that regard, he ministered to a generation, 2 or 3, of folks that saw themselves largely as being outside of the Jewish tradition. Young beats, hippies, New Age folks who weren't necessarily learned or at home in classical Jewish life. The fourth piece here that I want to make mention of, which I think is fascinating, was coined by Mosella Mitchell, one of the first scholars to write on Thurman several decades ago. She described Thurman as a kind of modern shamanistic figure. And I think it's a very apt description because on the one hand, he was religiously literate in ways that most people are not. He was a voracious reader across traditions. But he also was trained as an academic, that is to say, in the historical critical methods of his time. And still, he really saw himself essentially as a kind of spiritual guide, to move people from one state of consciousness to the other, from one reality to the other, which is what Mosella Mitchell has in mind and heart in using the coinage of the shaman, a person that could heal by taking people in and through different kinds of journeys. Here's Reb Zalman reflecting again, probably 50 years later, on listening to Thurman preach at Marsh Chapel. During his talks and sermons, Thurman had a wonderful way of pausing that was simply amazing. It was as if he was looking for just the right word, looking and looking, until everyone wanted to help him with the word, but he didn't care. But in that pausing, people also tended to fall into the space and silence he had created. That was intentional, of course. Until finally he would speak again and cover you with the word. Such a beautiful image. He would cover you with the word. He would say something like, the luminous darkness, and catch you on the inside of the paradox. Thurman, by the way, much to the agitation of some of his colleagues at BU, institute a policy that there would be 30 minutes of quiet meditation before the Sunday services at BU. And he was constantly engaged in ritual innovation. Here is Howard Thurman in 1963 visiting his student, one of his most faithful students, interestingly. Rabbi Zalman invited him ostensibly to lecture at 2 universities in Western Canada, but he also invited him because it was his son's bar mitzvah. And he wanted his Rebbe, he wanted one of his masters, to bless the family, which is common practice in Hasidic circles. And so he prepared for this visit in the following way. This is Thurman. This is an unpublished piece about his Canada experience. On the second floor of his office, this is Zalman's office, a room which cannot be easily described, there are many photographic studies of various individuals who have figured significantly in his life. Particularly striking is the picture of his master, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. That's the picture you saw. Schachter Shalomi said, I want you to sit here for 15 minutes without being disturbed because I want you to open all the windows of your spirit so you can get a feeling of the place where I live and work and think. And then when you are away from here, the climate that you get now, you can carry with you, and you can put me in it and see me in my setting. This is one mystic asking of the other, his teacher and mentor, I want you to be able to visualize me concretely in my place of work. And when we are apart, I want you to be able to think of me and bless me. Here's Roger Kamenetz, who is the author of the best-selling, award-winning book, The Jew and the Lotus. Some of you might remember it. Here's how he spoke of Schachter Shalomi. When I met him, I finally understood the whole tradition of oral masters who are best appreciated in person and who inspire others through the incredible flow of ideas, images, and illuminating tales. In other words, people that take you on journeys of heart and mind. Though he holds a degree in the psychology of religion, he has taught at major universities and published both popular and scholarly works. He is much more in the line of a classic teacher of wisdom or a holy man. He is charismatic and spontaneous with a highly developed theatrical sense and a touch of the clown. Look at the picture of Reb Zalman now in older age with the Dalai Lama. Those smiles, right? A demonstration that to be a serious, thoughtful, religious leader does not require you to be dour. As Leonard Cohen once said, arguably the great bard of Canada, in one of his final concerts, Leonard, take it easy. I want to end with this notion of interreligious hospitality. This is the 5th, and I want to tell a story, because it's late in the day, and if I try and do anything more academic, I clearly will put many of you to sleep. Reb Zalman says that on the very first day that he arrived at the BU campus, as a fairly young Hasidic rabbi, nervous, excited about studying at a Methodist university, there was nowhere to pray. And so he stumbled into Marsh Chapel. I don't know that I believe that there was nowhere else to pray, but he was a wonderful storyteller. In any case, he stumbles into Marsh Chapel and he says, he went immediately into the main sanctuary, and even for this pioneering figure, it was too much. As Soren and others can tell you, there is a lot of Christian iconography there. Crosses and Jesus and the disciples, etc. And so he said, the only place that I could pray was in the hallway, in the vestibule. And so he put on his prayer shawl, it was still black and white, and he put on his prayer boxes, and he began to pray. And lo and behold, a tall, casually dressed African-American man comes over to him and gently says, would you come back tomorrow? I think I can help you find a more suitable place to pray. And Zalman, embarrassed, not sure what to say, is not going to explain all of the theological issues that he was experiencing in that moment, and says, of course. He comes back the next day, and here's what he reports. The next day I entered Marsh Chapel and was quite curious about what I would find. So this mysterious man takes him downstairs to a chapel, a large white candle was burning, and the Bible on the lectern was open to Psalm 139:7, which says, "Whither shall I flee from thy presence?" Which in English means, there is no place that I can go that God is not present. Remember, this is Psalm 139, the one that we saw before. The large cross was no longer where it was the day before, but rested on its side against a wall. Feeling very grateful to the janitor, that's who we thought this man was, I did my davening right here, right there. When I finished, I placed the cross back in its regular position and turned the Bible to Psalm 100. The Thanksgiving Psalm. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, in his courts with praise. And so the downstairs chapel became my prayer place for that morning onward. To me, and I've taught this many, many times, it's one of the most powerful examples of embodied interreligious hospitality. So much so that Dean Thurman doesn't even introduce himself. He doesn't say, by the way, I was just named one of the 10 greatest preachers in the United States by Ebony Magazine. I introduced nonviolent resistance in the United States. I am the pastor of the movement. He simply says, I'm going to find a place for you to pray. And then all of these embodied acts without saying a word, but playing this very sophisticated interreligious game is beautiful. And the young rabbi has enough of a growing sensitivity to reciprocate. And so he puts back the cross, because it is a Christian worship space for the rest of the day. He turns the pages of the Bible to Psalm 100 with a wink and a smile and says thank you. And importantly, blows out the candle so that it doesn't burn down the building. But these are the 5 pieces that I find fascinating about these two men, and I'm writing a joint biography of the two of them because I think, as I said, it's very significant for the genealogy of the work we're doing, and there's still much to learn from them. And people in both communities, that is in the African American Christian community and in the progressive Jewish community, know virtually nothing about their interactions and the influences. I simply could not be the Jew that I am without Howard Thurman. Thank you.